Hello, everybody. Welcome to another stream for History Valley Podcast. Today I'm joined by frequent guest of the channel, Dr. Robert and Price. And today we're going to be discussing the development and the redactional layers in the Pauline Epistles. So, how you been doing, Dr. Price?
Well, pretty well. Trying to cut down on my face stuffing project and working on a novel based on an outline left years ago by my friend and literary idol Lynn Carter. It's called Thongor Conquers the Underground World, and I'm having a lot of fun. First time I've ever written anything this long, any fiction that is this long. So that's a lot of fun. I hope you're doing well.
Yeah, I am. Thank you. So when you look at Paul's letters, and we've discussed this many times in prior shows, that you believe if they have many authors, it's not one person writing these letters, because they claim that they're written by Paul and a few of his co-authors, but you see something else going on. And we have Marcion's version of Paul's letters, which I've discussed this with guests on the channel like Jack Bull and Marcus Vincent, because they believe that the Marcionite version of the Apostolikon, as it's called, is an earlier version of Paul's epistles that is either closer to the original or is the original version of Paul. And then canonical Paul is an expansion of that text. What do you think about that?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me because, well, for one reason, the alternative doesn't really make a whole lot of sense either for a Marcionite abridgment of the gospel or the epistles, because as Jason Badoon and others have shown, there are plenty of places where what remains, what remains of the text anyway, the stuff that is familiar to us that Marcion didn't chop, if that's what he was doing, that he didn't have, let's say, that he did have, right? It often clashes with Marcion's own views, and that is highlighted as much as it could possibly be by Tertullian and Justin Martyr and others saying, he did a lousy job cutting this of material that didn't mesh with his own heretical theology. Why didn't he cut out this and the other passage, which plainly militate against his belief? What a dummy. Well, I tell you what it's evidence for. The claim that Tertullian admits that Marcion made, that Marcion did not cut anything out, that the extra material that Tertullian and others were reading had been added in to Catholicize the texts of the gospel and the epistles. And it sure appears that way, and from various angles, both from the polemics against the Marcionite versions of these texts that do leave much of it untouched, and also from the internal considerations, where, as the text now stands in its canonical version, there are telltale marks of interpolation. William O. Walker and Winsome Monroe both wrote fascinating, comprehensive, and careful books about these layers of interpolation in the Pauline epistles. I mean, whether you think it was Polycarp who did it, or who knows? It just kind of looks like that. You can bracket the whole drama with Marcion and Polycarp and the Marcionites versus the Catholics. Nonetheless, you've got texts that look like they were fiddled with by somebody adding material to them. So I take it quite seriously. And it would also help make the arguments a bit more coherent. You can all, I mean, I always like to point out First Corinthians as the classic example where one chapter contradicts the previous one, not only in details, but in the whole stance and the whole point. Can Christians eat meat previously offered in sacrifice to idols? Well, yes, no, yes. What is going on? Is it was the author a multiple personality, and he different ones dictated the letter? It's ridiculous. Now one could say that some of them claim to have multiple authorship, Paul, Timothy, Silas, etc. Well, it could be that Paul said, if you guys want to add anything, feel free to do it. We're going to have to recopy the thing anyway. Well, maybe that's why there are different viewpoints, but it's still very odd, even if that's viable, to think that they so contradicted one another and that Paul would let it pass. And there's a great example of that also in the Epistle to the Romans. Marcion's text did not have chapters 9 through 11. And it ought to ring a bell, an alarm right off the bat, since in those chapters he speaks of Israel, whereas in the rest of the letter he speaks of Jews. Like, why that? It's like somebody's favored vocabulary. You're not going to change something like that on a whim. It's sort of unconscious, like a signature mark. But beyond that, if you try to make sense of those three chapters and how on earth they go together, good luck. You have one whole section of it that seems to be talking about God's plan to save everybody, at least whole groups. He says, yes, I know Jews have pretty much written off Christianity and they're not interested in it, but don't give up on them. You see, this was the providence of God to put them on the sidelines so that we, Christian evangelists, would pretty much be forced to go to a different clientele and preach to these pagans and heathens and Gentile God-fearers. And we're doing well. They're flocking to the Christian banner. But don't worry. Now, in fact, you Gentile converts, don't start getting swell-headed and thinking, well, we are the cat's meow. We are really the ones God likes because those Jews spurned God's offer. Hey, don't count them out yet. They'll have their turn. Don't you see that once they see all these former worshipers of Apollo and Osiris and Mithras and Isis converting to Christ instead, they're going to think, wow, we were never able to do that in any great numbers. Maybe there is something to this. Maybe this is of God. Maybe we ought to give it a second look. And when they do, they're going to like what they see this time, and then everybody gets together. The full number of the saved is fulfilled. Okay, that's coherent, whether you find it plausible or not. But then you start getting into a discussion of individual predestination. And he starts quoting from the Old Testament, Jacob have I loved, but Esau have I hated. And he says, you see, that just shows that even from the womb, God made up his mind about these two, and he does that with everybody. And who are you to challenge his right to do it? He's the creator. He can make of the clay anything he wants. And then you get into yet another one, or 1 Corinthians 15. What is the issue there? Do they not believe in the resurrection of Jesus? Or do they believe in it in some fashion, but don't believe there's going to be an end time resurrection of believers? Or is there no belief in any life after death? It seems like it switches back and forth. Where is any consistent logic? I mean, piece by piece there is, but it looks like people have just taped together, pages ripped out of this and that book. So to me, you have to suspect that you've got later additions. And when you actually have evidence of earlier copies that lacked some of this material, well, I'd say that's you got to award the prize to Marcion. He had the original, not that he created the original, right? Some of these more recent scholars have said readings like individual verses, different synonyms used, a longer or shorter statement about something. The differences between Marcion's text and the one that gained dominance and is canonical, they aren't based on Marcion changing it, or even in some cases, now I'm saying where they have the basic text in common, but there are these little differences. That it turns out that in light of increased manuscript evidence, it turns out these textual variations are common to other textual traditions, the Western text, etc., or Syriac sources. And so it looks like that Marcion's text, whether it's original in those respects or not, certainly was not really exceptional. And then you get into these prologues written to the Pauline epistles. Some think, I think for pretty good, though slender reasons, that they're Marcionite in origin, but almost doesn't matter. The order of the epistles sometimes reflects that in Marcion's canon, but then it turns out there are other non-Marcionite sources that have some of the same order, and so what is going on? It's a messier picture than we had thought. It's not just Marcion over here, everybody else over here. And so Marcion apparently did a lot less to these texts than anybody had thought for a long time. And of course, this gets really foggy and messy if you hold that Paul's epistles are infallible, inspired scripture. Because if you have to just make educated guesses as to what might be genuine Pauline text, you have your work cut out for you in defining a Pauline theology that should govern Protestant or Christian belief. Good luck. And I'll just finish this with one observation. A couple of scholars, one Catholic, and this would be Jerome Murphy O'Connor, the other Protestant, Frederick Vissa, independently said that we really can't afford to take seriously these interpolation hypotheses, because if we do, well, they didn't put it this way, but we're not going to be able to play the game anymore. We're not going to be sure. We're not going to be able to be sure what the authoritative apostle wrote or what Jesus really said. Oh my gosh, what are you going to do then? That's why conservatives hate the Jesus seminar, right? Because whether you agree with the results or not, it takes a lot of guts to say, hey, it looks like he couldn't have and didn't say all of this stuff. You better try to distill what he really said. And even then you don't know. Well, even the Jesus seminar is not open to doing the same thing with the Pauline epistles, as I know too well from personal experience. So this is very controversial for people for whom this is a theological matter. For folks like us who are simply interested in it, as a classicist is interested in the Iliad and the Odyssey, it makes it all the more interesting and, dare I say it, entertaining. It's a bigger mystery to try to solve, and the satisfaction is in the work, not necessarily the results, since there will probably never be any definitive results.
Bob Kelly, thank you for your super chat. Is it the case that Paul only quotes Jesus once? I got that from David Oliver Smith, and that once was from a vision. seems that Paul wasn't even thinking of a human sage, excuse me. Would a follower of Socrates never quote him?
Well, that is pretty interesting because there's a huge, it's probably settled now, but there was a long standing debate as to what in Plato's dialogues that portray Socrates in debate with various others. Is this really a transcript of anything Socrates said? Could have been, at least some of it. And at least the traditional consensus was, well, yeah, probably in the earliest group of dialogues, Plato had even taken notes. We're told that the disciples of ancient philosophers did that in Greece anyway. It was too good to miss, and they didn't have video recording phones and so on. So yeah, that's possible. And in those, it's interesting that Socrates mainly raises questions. But then you have middle dialogues that seem to be a bit more definitive, as if Plato knows Socrates didn't actually say this, but he thought that if you carried out the implications of what he was saying, this is what's implied. And he figured, well, if it was implicit in Socrates, I'm not going to take credit for it. I'm just going to sort of, like Socrates was a midwife, I'm going to bring to birth an explicit statement of the Socratic wisdom. But then in the latest dialogues, most scholars think Socrates never said any of this stuff. It's Plato, as a loyal disciple of Socrates, saying, what would he have said about certain topics? I think I know his thinking well enough to surmise what he would say about this, so I'm going to write it up that way. This really is a worldwide sort of a thing, like when a Hindu mystic wanted to write about non-dualism or something. What he would do was to set it forth in what was ostensibly a commentary on one of the Upanishads. And it was partly because he didn't think his mere opinions would get the same hearing as something that was supposed to be simply an explication of scripture, right? Or maybe he really thought people needed help in fathoming what the scripture said, and such a writer figured he knew what it meant. Who knows? And there's pretty blurred line between them, but that's pretty common. You didn't want to take credit for what you were really getting from your master, and on the other hand, you did want your master's clout. So it's certainly not some kind of hypercritical paranoia like some think, whether in the case of Plato or Apollonius of Tyana or Paul. It would be what you'd expect, and so. Did Paul or whoever wrote these things, well, yeah, I was dealing with Plato at the end of the question first, but that seems a reasonable way of dividing up what he did, and it illustrates the different ways one could quote or paraphrase or extrapolate from the authoritative author. Now, in the Pauline epistles, what David Oliver Smith is arguing is that a lot of the stuff that is presented in the epistles as Paul's wisdom really was written up by somebody else, borrowing and rewriting material from the Gospels. And he has a number of parallels. I don't find a lot of them that compelling. I sometimes, and David knows I think this, we're old pals, that he might be engaging in a kind of parallelomania there. Often great minds in the same general milieu think alike, so, who knows? But he thinks that Paulinist authors, not Paul himself, but Paulinist authors were putting words of Jesus, or at least words from the gospel sayings, into the mouth of Paul, the Paul they pretended to be. I think it a bit more likely that it was just some general orally transmitted Christian wisdom that got put into the mouth of Jesus by the gospel narrators, but were embodied in the epistles, whether by Paul or a later writer. I'm not so sure you can just dogmatically say the one was lifted from the other, but I admit there's just kind of a hair's breadth between these two views. Now, ostensibly, is Paul ever quoting Jesus? I don't think you can be sure of that or even make it look likely. For instance, when he talks about the Last Supper, he says, I presented to you what I received from the Lord, namely on the night on which he was handed over, he took the bread and said this, and the cup and said that. Right. Well, what does he mean? He received it from the Lord. Was he at the table at the time? He doesn't claim that. Nobody else in the history of the church ever has either. Whereas he does in Galatians use similar language about having his gospel message revealed to him, not by any human agent, but by the Lord himself, by Christ. Well, that sounds so similar to this thing in 1 Corinthians about the words of institution that I think Chaim Maccabee and various others that have theorized this are probably right that this is supposed to be a revelation. It's also possible that instead of that, it's an interpolation, as has been argued before. Then there is the thing in First Thessalonians, when he's talking about the end time resurrection, and he says, this we say to you by the word of the Lord. And you have the archangel and the trumpet and the shout and the dead rising and all that. What Lord does he mean? Well, I forget the name of the author. I read a couple of books about Pauline eschatology, and I now mix them up. But you can see just about all these lines either quoted or paraphrased in a long stretch of Old Testament scripture. And if what the writer is doing is simply to condense a bunch of Old Testament text, well, the Lord he's talking about is Jehovah. He's not talking about Jesus. I mean, he needn't be. I suppose he could be, but it certainly looks like he's just making what they call a cento of Old Testament prophetic passages. What about the old favorite that when he's talking about divorce and so on, he says, this I say by the word of the Lord, a man should not put away his wife, and so on and so on. And then a little later on the same topic, he says, now I say not the Lord, that, and I think I have his approval or his wisdom, whatever. This is what you ought to do in this ambiguous aspect of the matter. I don't have any authoritative reference to refer to, but this is what I think. I think you can trust me as an apostle. Well, does he mean I happen to have here a saying of Jesus, like a hadith from Jesus? It's certainly possible, but it seems to me there is no reason to think so. In fact, at the end of chapter 14, what does he say? If anybody thinks he is a prophet, and presumes to disagree with what I'm saying, let him recognize that what I am writing to you is a word from the Lord. Well, that seems to me to tip the whole thing over to the side of saying that there are certain things that God has revealed to me. They're not simply my opinion, but I don't make these things up. I don't know. I can't tune into the radio and establish a contact, a hotline to heaven. Hey, God, what do you think? No, it comes to me or it doesn't. But I think I know the mind of Christ well enough to know that this is the Christian approach. So it's not a word from the Lord, but I think it's very plausible apostolic wisdom, don't you? So I think that case is exceedingly weak, that there ever is an attempted or an ostensible Quote, F. Bruce and other apologists repeat as if it were a liturgy those two First Corinthians verses and say, aha, you see, early Christians were careful to separate their own insights from the teachings of Jesus. So we don't have to worry about the Gospels being fake or anything. No, they wouldn't have let anybody add anything of their own to it. Did these people never read any of the Gnostic texts, the Nag Hammadi manuscripts, and so on? People were fabricating sayings of Jesus like it was a cottage industry. How come they never noticed that? Those people weren't really Christians, right? They were Gnostics. Look, you can't artificially separate them. They thought they were Christians. You know, if they could do this, why couldn't whoever wrote the New Testament? So I'm sorry, I've over answered your question, but it's one of my favorites. So can't control myself.
We don't got any additional super chats right now. How many times do you think Paul's epistles were edited? And actually, let me rephrase that question. From what time span do you think Paul's epistles were edited? And when do you think it reached its absolute final form into the text we have now?
I would think I go with John Knox and David Trobish and others. It seems to me that it was probably Polycarp of Smyrna, a guy who hated Marcion, who wanted to co-opt his skinnier scripture with less material in it. It was only Christian stuff, not the Old Testament, and only the one gospel, and 10 Pauline epistles minus the pastorals. He seemed to, this was getting very popular in the ancient world, and it seems like Polycarp or whoever, but very likely Polycarp, thought, you know, if you can't beat them, maybe you shouldn't join them, but maybe you can co-opt them. I think that's the thing to do. We're not going to give up the Old Testament, but it wouldn't be bad to have a distinctly and overtly Christian scripture to go with it. Let's have an Old and a New Testament. And what's going to be in that New Testament? Well, not just Paul, because, Marcion even thought that in some sense his one gospel was Paul's gospel. Whether he actually wrote it or somebody copied it down from his preaching, who knows? But it was Pauline, and Paul seemed to have been kind of a suspicious character in the eyes of many second century Orthodox or Catholic Christians. And so what Polycarp set out to do was to say, we're going to keep Paul, but we are going to have to kind of sanitize him by adding this and that. And in fact, 3 new Pauline epistles where he's very anti-Gnostic and implicitly anti-Marcionite. That will put the right spin on Paul. And of course, there's some weird stuff in these other letters in their Marcionite form. So we're going to have to add some material there to calm Paul down. We don't want to make it out that he was the only epistle writer or the only apostle, as Marcion claims. So let's stuff the apostolic ballot box here by composing the Acts of the Apostles that will show just how great Peter was, that he was just as good as Paul, almost indistinguishable from Paul. And as for the epistles, aren't there any by other apostles? No? Well, let's see what we can scrape up. How about the Epistle of Jude? Maybe that was Judas Thomas's brother, or maybe it was Thaddeus, one of the 12. How about the Epistle of James? By Jesus' brother, or by James, son of Zebedee, or were they cousins anyway? What the heck? 1st and 2nd Peter? Yeah. Sounds good. And 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, well, actually, they're anonymous, but let's say they were by John. What the heck? And then Hebrews, well, let's say it's by Paul. Might be. And so they hammered out this fuller scripture. And that seems to have happened under Polycarp's regime as Bishop of Smyrna, which would place it pretty early, somewhere before the middle of the 2nd century, though there were competing editions. And in fact, you only had Polycarp's 27-book New Testament added on to the Septuagint Old Testament in 365 CE or AD, when Bishop Athanasius circulated an Easter letter to all churches and monasteries saying, okay, everybody, these are the official books. This is the canon. From now on, nobody appeals to any of those other books. Shepherd of Hermas, trash it. Gospel of the Hebrews, burn it. Gospel of Thomas, line your birdcage with it. It's only these 27 books. And when my agents come around again, they're going to inspect your library and make sure you have gotten rid of them. Capiche? And that is why we still have the Nag Hammadi texts. The monks of St. Pachomius, when they received this list, they said, I don't want to destroy those texts. They're a little weird, but they ought to survive. They ought to be available if anybody in the future wants to read them. Hey, what say we take them up to that cave and put them in clay jars, very much like the Dead Sea Scrolls that were discovered in 1947, 2 years after the Nag Hammadi finds. And sure enough, I mean, you can tell this because some of the waste paper used to stuff the hard covers of these books that contain the Gnostic texts they have identifying marks saying that this paper was used in that monastery. So you can pretty easily put the pieces together. They had to hide them. They had to deep six them because better that than burning them. And so the extras survived, but not in many places. So I would say probably the list was first defined by Polycarp in something like 130 CE and then made official over 200 years later. And of course, even that took some time to be universally accepted. And it isn't quite universally accepted today. After all, in the Armenian Monophysite Church, they've got 3rd Corinthians as part of the canon. And the Ethiopian Monophysite Church, they got 88 books in their Bible. So, I believe it cover to cover, but what's in those covers? Right? That's the big question.
Did Polycarp actually state that he assembled a 27-book canon collection?
As I remember, David Trobisch concludes that because of the uniform use of the nomina sacra, these abbreviations above the line whenever you had a holy name like Jesus Christ, you'd have IHS there and some other one for Jesus. And it was like too holy. It's like, hallowed be thy name. The same way that Jewish scribes would have to write the tetragrammaton, the 4-letter name of God, but they knew they weren't supposed to read it aloud, lest they risk taking the name of the Lord your God in vain. So they knew when they were reading it aloud, to not say Yahweh, like I just did, but to say Adonai, a word that was somehow less sacrosanct and meant Lord. It was a divine name elsewhere too, like Adonis, same name. But the fact that there is that uniformity, and it's either that, it's been some time since I've read this, or some other marks in the Greek Septuagint as used by Christians, that persuaded Trobisch that this was an edition compiled by a single editor, with the who ordered the Old Testament books in the familiar order, not like the Hebrew Bible. And so I can't remember all the details of it, but I found it pretty convincing. So he looks like the only viable candidate. Trobisch didn't say he had proven that it was Polycarp, but he said he was the only viable candidate based on the people we know. Like if he really did expand Luke and dedicated the result to Theophilus, well, Polycarp was a friend of Bishop Theophilus in Antioch. That kind of makes you wonder. And let's see. Oh, come on, Price. Oh, yeah. One odd little thing is that, let's see. In John 15, I think, the true vine discourse, Jesus says that he will save those who bear much fruit, polycarpos. And in the pastoral epistles is something very similar, where he says, bring the scrolls that I left with Carpus. And this doesn't prove anything, I realize, but these two instances, the one in the pastorals, I guess it's 2 Timothy probably, that one is in material that scholars have long suggested was composed by Polycarp, partly based on its similarity in content and vocabulary to one of the apostolic fathers, Polycarp's epistle to the Philippians. And as for the thing in John, this is in a sacramental portion of John, and therefore it should stem from the ecclesiastical redactor, as Bultmann called him. And this was a guy who interpolated the originally Gnostic Gospel of John. And as he did several other things, reintroducing futuristic eschatology and other things. So I think it all works out real well. I know it's a lattice of possibilities. So much of this stuff is, but then again, that's why I'm always quick to say, remind yourself that all of our results, all of our theorizing has to be tentative. And so if it stimulates thought and leads to other possibilities, that might be as much as you can hope for, but it's worth it.
Somnium is dreaming. Thank you for your super chat. Do you think that there could be more early text to be found? If so, what would you most like to discover? Thank you for your time.
Well, it's certainly possible because there are loads of ancient Greek texts, I think in the British Museum Library, that have never been translated, partly because some of them were overwritten. And they're as palimpsests, right? That they were running out of papyrus or parchment, and they said, well, we got other copies of this. Let's just wash the ink off, let it dry, and write something new on it. Well, actually, you can use infrared, I think it is, to read the original because enough traces of it are left. And so there are texts that have not yet been rediscovered that way. From, I think, Herculaneum, next door to Pompeii, there a whole lot of scrolls were pretty much fried when Mount Vesuvius exploded. And so you have all of these apparently useless, tightly coiled scrolls that nobody figured they'd ever be able to read. If you tried to open it up, it'd just collapse into charcoal fragments. But some genius came up, and I don't say that sarcastically, right? Some brilliant person found a way to treat these things so that you could make them flexible again and open them up and read them. They found a big, hitherto known, but what was the guy's name? Philodemus. Yeah, they had the fragments of Philodemus, who was a Greek philosopher, but there wasn't much to it. But what do you know? They found this big deposit of his wisdom in Herculaneum, but they could see that much of it, but they didn't know what the heck was in it. Well, now they know. And so you don't know what could be in there. There could be lost gospels, epistles that got lost in the mail, or deep sixed by the readers who didn't like them. Who knows? And if we could get enough people together to make this a big project, oh boy, the results could really be exciting. And I sure wouldn't be, well, I would be surprised, but it's by no means out of the question. You could find other epistles of Paul. You'd have to suspect that they'd probably be just inexpensive notes, or why wouldn't they have been preserved by the early churches? But that doesn't prove anything. You could certainly have other epistles by Paul. I shouldn't bring this up, but one of these days I want to publish a fun little project of mine called Paul, the Lost Epistles, where I took a bunch of topics that are not really addressed adequately in the Pauline epistles and decided to do what some of these ancient pseudepigraphists did and ask myself, if Paul had addressed these topics in his letters, what might he have said? Do I know this author, or whether it's actually Paul or somebody else? Do I know him well enough to psych him out and figure what he would say, whether I would say it or not? And so I wrote another 14 epistles. Paul's epistles, the lost epistle to Antioch, to Alexandria, to Cenchrea, and so on and so on and so on. It's a fun thing. And then I added a new apocalypse of Paul, the two that we know of from the ancient world. And I figure, what the heck, why not another one? One of these days, I'll make a little self-published book out of that and try to confuse readers everywhere. Oh, yeah. What would I like to see most? Yeah. I would love to see the gospel according to the Hebrews, the gospel according to the Nazarenes, the gospel according to the Ebionites, Papias's oracles of our Lord, and there's some other stuff, I'm sure. There are various others, but I would, or if there were an intact copy of the secret gospel of Mark, assuming there actually was such a thing. Oh boy, would I love to see that. So let's keep our fingers crossed here that maybe they will come up with something juicy out of these scrolls.
In 1 Corinthians 15, when the Eucharist is quoted, the saying of Jesus, do you think the person that wrote this got it from another text or another Christian text, or did this person put it into the mouth of Jesus from reading the Bacchae or something like it?
Well, I don't think it was necessarily a memory of something Jesus actually said. It seems like Alfred Loisy said long ago that whichever you're reading from the Synoptic Gospels or 1 Corinthians, this sounds like a piece of liturgy because someone is explaining the elements of a rite. Why are we drinking this? Well, this is, and then the officiant speaks in the role of Jesus. I mean, that's still the point of all ordained priests, right? That they're stand-ins for Jesus, kind of like an Elvis impersonator. And so they would say, in the name of Jesus, this is my blood, which is shed for you for the forgiveness of sins. And then the bread, this is my flesh. All of you eat of it. I give it for the sins of the world on your behalf, whatever, slight differences. And Loisy said, this isn't casual conversation. It isn't conversation at all. Someone is reading a role in a liturgical script. I think he's right. It must have begun that way. And one of my books, I forget which one, I point out that if you want to see the force of my argument, think of any media version you've seen of the life of Jesus and what they do with the wording at the Last Supper. They seem to know the problem, and so they reword it so Jesus could plausibly be depicted simply saying this in conversation. So if you take a look at that, like my favorite example would be in Jesus Christ Superstar. This is my blood you drink. This is my body you eat. If you would remember me when you eat and drink, I must be mad thinking I'll be remembered. Oh, it's great stuff. But you won't find that wording in the Gospels. And there are other ones. I gave at least one other example where they seem to realize this is liturgical poetry, not a report of somebody's table talk. So I don't think it goes back to Jesus. In fact, it's more like something in the Didache, which is a formulaic prayer. It's not put in the mouth of Jesus, but it's like, safeguard the unity of your church, that we may be one, even as the grain from all the plants have gone into this bread, a single loaf, and all that stuff. It's like liturgical poetry. And then they say, if a visiting prophet wants to do his own thing, freestyle, let him do it. He's inspired by the Holy Spirit, but hey, you're not. So if he's not there, you read the script, and here it is. So I think that it was liturgy, not remembered speech.
We got another super chat. Michael Allen, thank you for your super chat. Bob, is a Gnostic outlook sensible in the aftermath of the consideration of theodicy? I'm not 100% sold that an intelligent ignition didn't get it all started originally, but it's a far cry from worshiping it. Your thoughts?
Yeah. On the one hand, the theodicy business is the problem of evil. To me, really rules out the idea of a traditional, providential, loving God. Every one of these commercials you see for Shriners or St. Jude's or whatever, with these tragically deformed young kids, if there were a God who was really in loving control of everything, you wouldn't see that. One little baby is born with cancer of the eyes. Well, as Johnny Smith says in The Dead Zone, God's been a real sport to me. It just can't be. I mean, that's enough to rule out that view of God. Now, if you take it from the question of design, that there is amazing order and complexity in the world, like the reproductive system. You mean to tell me one living being emerges from the body of another one? To me, that is so mind-blowing. The stork almost seems more plausible. But, of course, the stork doesn't actually deliver them. It happens through sex and reproduction, right? But this is so complex. And then you think of the ecosystem and the mutation of animals into all these different astounding forms. And you do have to start wondering, could these advocates of intelligent design have something? I mean, it is so intricate. Wouldn't it make the most sense if there were an intelligent designer? But I stop right there, because the question then inevitably rises, who designed him? Like, where does it stop? Is it an infinite regress? And what would such a designer be like? It's just a big X. And so if you say, well, I think I can solve the riddle of the complexity of the universe, let's call it problem Z. Well, I got the answer. It's X. Don't you see the problem there? You can't solve one enigma with another insoluble enigma, right? So, and plus, if the minute you start down that road and say, well, God did it, hallelujah, you're just going back to the Middle Ages, right? The God of the gaps approach. We'll never be able to figure this out rationally. What causes mental illness? I guess it must be evil spirits. Well, if they stopped right there, you can guess where we'd be today, at least in the mental health field. We're not in such a great place anyway, but it would be a lot worse, right? Or what causes diseases? Germs? What's that? Bacteria? Huh? What are you talking about? No, it must be evil spirits. Good luck ever discovering medicine. I mean, of course, they had some like roots and stuff that shamans knew about. I mean, they were sort of early scientists, got to give them credit. But that they knew to do that, right? They already knew you had to treat an illness or a wound with something proven to have a chemical effect. Well, they weren't stupid, but you might be stupid if you decided where the universe come from. It must be God, some cosmic wizard. No. You've got to say, where's the next door to open? Now, it might turn out there aren't any more doors to open, but you got to keep trying, because that's the only thing that's worked in the past. Now, finally, about Gnosticism. Is that applicable? Well, in one sense it is. The approach of Gnosticism is easily compatible with atheism and agnosticism, because what I mean by that is that Gnostics posited a kind of a hierarchy that you had in any society, a bunch of regular folks, not dumb, skilled in many ways, well-meaning. They're religious, and it's good for them and good for the world that they are, and they're they're not to be scoffed at or despised. But there is a lower tier that is running rampant in America today, basically just two-legged animals. People that are motivated by nothing but the most primitive urges and have no regard for anyone else's property, well-being, anything, right? They're basically cavemen or something, right? Let's not sugarcoat it. That's if you're afraid of an elitist, I'm going to get more elite, because the Gnostics believed that on the top of the pyramid was the elite minority of the knowers, which is what Gnostic means. Those who had the special insight to understand the rest of the thing, when neither the second or the third tier could. And Plato thought such people should rule. They should be philosopher kings. I don't think that's worth the risk, since a lot of people think they're philosopher kings who may be kings but aren't philosophers, and you're going to have trouble on your hands. But that is, I think that one can embrace that Gnostic diagnosis of the human condition without being a snooty elitist. Because if you are, you're not quite as high on the totem pole as you may think, right? That egotism is a sign of immaturity. But what is the Gnostic attitude? New Testament writers, like in Jude and in First John, seem to think, even in First Corinthians, they seem to think that the ones who are gifted with special endowments must look down their sanctimonious noses at the common run of humanity, much less the real sinners, and they think I'm pretty darn great. No. The real Gnostic view is like that of the Mahayana Buddhist bodhisattvas, who understood that they had attained the acme of enlightenment. And because they were enlightened, they realized it wasn't their private possession. And they looked down with compassion on all beings and tried their best to help them up the ladder through reincarnation after incarnation, right? But nobody is finally saved until everybody is. And that's the Gnostic approach, in my opinion. They didn't think, the rest of you go to hell. No. I mean, some of them might have, but the logic of the thing was you look at them as sheep without a shepherd, not the accursed multitude that knoweth not the law. It's the compassion of the Nietzschean Übermensch. And others may try to drag him down, but he doesn't bear them ill will. He tries to spite their blind efforts at self-stultification and at stultifying him to keep his head above the water and to lift them out of it if only they will come. So that doesn't really deal with why is there evil and adversity in the world, but it is a key aspect of Gnosticism, and one that really does not depend on a belief in actual metaphysical entities. Compatible with it, but doesn't require it.
When you look at the Apostolikon, do you think any of the Pauline text contained within that collection goes back to the historical Paul / Simon Magus, or do you think pretty much everything in there, almost everything in there, are also fabrications?
There's a section of Romans that seems to share some emphases with the so-called Great Declaration of Simon Magus, though most of that is just a boring allegorical interpretation of human physiology as the key to the symbolism of the Garden of Eden. It's boring to me, but it seems to me there's a bit of material in there that would be compatible with Simonianism, but not much. In Galatians, the whole thing seems Marcionite to me, but I kind of hold the theory that Marcion was himself a disciple of Simon Magus, and that there was some confusion because I believe it's Irenaeus who says that Simon had a disciple named Marcus, who was called Marcus Magus, because he was ostensibly a miracle worker and taught people to speak in tongues, which is not far from what you see the apostles do in a few places in Acts. And if this Marcus was Marcion, as Stephen Huller suggested, which makes sense to me, but we don't know, it's just speculation, then I suddenly look at the passage in Galatians where it says that God did not give the Torah to Moses, or let's say God did not directly give it to the people of Israel. No, he used an intermediary to do it. Well, you don't need an intermediary for one individual talking to a group. I mean, he's the intermediary, so to speak. You only need an intermediary between two groups who are negotiating whatever, like a sovereignty treaty. The conqueror and the conquered, they'll sign a loyalty treaty and so on. You revere me as your true king, and I'll defend you militarily. So, okay, you'd have a mediator saying, well, what do you think? You both able to abide by this? And that sure seems to fit Simon Magus, who didn't yet have the single demiurge that Marcion would have, but he believed the law was given by angels. I think maybe Basilides did too, but I know Simon Magus did. And that sounds so Simonian that I wouldn't be surprised if that was a piece of Simonianism inherited by Marcion and incorporated into the epistle.
That's interesting that Irenaeus seems to refer to him as Marcus Magus, since Marcion was originally called Marcion.
Well, yeah, he would be just a diminutive of youth or affection by his family or whatever, but it's just another version. Marcus, Mark, Marcion.
Well, if this is true that Marcion was his one of his disciples, that would indicate that Simon Magus was alive at least in the late 1st century Common Era.
Hmm. Yeah, it's very tough to pin him down because of the references as a contemporary of Peter, or later on when he becomes kind of a Dr. Faustus character. In fact, Dr. Faustus, some think, is based on Simon Magus.
What parallels are there between Dr. Faustus and Simon Magus?
The idea that he was sort of a fallen or heretical Christian, because he's depicted as being, I think, an instructor in a seminary of some sort. And though he's like these Renaissance guys, or even like Philip Melanchthon in the Reformation, they didn't yet separate astrology from astronomy, and they thought there might be something to Rosicrucian type mysticism. And he, in the beginning of what is it? Christopher Marlowe's Dr. Faustus. Faust is some kind of teacher of metaphysics, and a couple of his students accost him in the marketplace and say, Faustus, plumb the depths of that which you profess. And it's like, put your money where your mouth is. And this leads him to summon up Mephistopheles. Well, he wasn't a Satan worshiper. The whole business of invoking demons and the like, as you can see from reading like the Key of Solomon and so on, it was that Christians who were magicians would bind the demons and force them to do their will, as Solomon had bound Asmodeus and forced him to carry the huge building blocks for the temple. Solomon wasn't a Satanist. That wasn't the idea. It was just like Jesus says that you can despoil the strong man of his goods if you're a stronger one and can bind him first. So anyway, he does conjure up Mephistopheles, and there's and look at Goethe's Faust. It starts with his version of Faust translating the Gospel of John. And he's stuck on verse 1, and he says, in the beginning was the Word. Somehow that doesn't seem adequate. Perhaps it would be closer to the truth to say, in the beginning was the deed. No, in the beginning was the thought, etc. And he goes through several things. He's a Bible translator. He's a Christian, but he gets mixed up with the wrong crowd and with the good old Mephisto. And that's kind of the way Simon Magus was portrayed. Acts says he was baptized and became a Christian, but still wanted to learn magic tricks, for which he offered to pay Peter. It's an impressive stunt you're pulling here. I'll be glad to pay if you'll let me in on the secret. And that's kind of Faustus-like. And I believe there is the aerial battle between Faust and I forget who, that mirrors Simon, Magus, and Peter, and also Jesus and Judas in the Toledo Yeshu. And so there's some. I read this book decades ago, but apparently the Simon Magus legends were a contribution to the Faust legend.
Got another super chat. Woohoo! Thank you for your super chat. How can Bob be so hypercritical thinking when it comes to early Christianity, but by right-wing conspiracy about baiting an eye? Excuse me.
Yeah, I find it astonishing that people that will grant me credit for having examined issues long and carefully in one area to which they're not hostile to my approach, because of extrinsic, unrelated political issues, seem to view me as an idiot savant and assume that I have simply ignorantly swallowed somebody's propaganda. Let me assure you that though obviously you and your careful considerations have come to different conclusions, it is possible to come to different ones from a different reading of the evidence. And in my opinion, that's what I've done. So thanks for the insult.
Do you think that the aerial combat between Jesus and Judas in the Told of Yeshu and that Faustus person that you mentioned earlier in another combat story, do you think they're both derivative of Peter and Simon doing the same thing in Acts?
I would imagine so, if only because well, it depends on what material the fashioners of the Faustus legend had available, because it might be that they were more familiar with the many circulating versions of the Toledo of Yeshu than they would have been with these apocryphal acts. But I mean, they weren't unknown. So I guess it could have been either one, since it's possible that some of these people had been familiar with either one of them.
Do you think those stories are unconnected?
Well, that one is parallel to the other on a strange and weird story. It makes you wonder, like when you have Eve and Pandora, or Iphigenia and Jephthah's daughter, and so forth. You want one Greek, the other biblical. You gotta wonder: are these simply people with imagination thinking alike, or are they two versions of a popular story that they both go back to, or did one know the other and do his own version, either purposely or inadvertently? Any of those things are possible, and I would think the same is true here. But this one is so strange. These two flying miracle workers and so on, and all of them with some kind of God and devil connection, at least loosely. It seems to me Faust is based on one or both of these earlier works.
Is some of the material in the Apostolikon version of Romans, which you say is probably was written by Simon Magus, also known as Paul? Do you think anything else in the Apostolikon could go back to him?
Let's see. Well, this I admit is a stretch, and it's probably not so, but I can't. When I read in 1 Corinthians 7, is it, where he says, don't Barnabas and I have the right to take along with us a sister as wife, as do Cephas and the Brethren of the Lord. I can't help thinking of the phenomena of the Virgine subintroducti, weird Latin phrase, hard to paraphrase, but there was this widespread thing that was controversial in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, where a holy man would travel with a female partner, both maintaining celibacy and not even legally married. There was also celibate marriage, which is a big thing in the apocryphal Acts of the Apostles. But there are 2 Clementine epistles on virginity. They're sort of lesser known Clement Apocrypha, and they're defending the practice. Some of the fathers on record thought that this is dangerously risky and brings us into disrepute, while others said, I guess, like 1 Corinthians 7, hey, look, the apostles did this. You got to trust us. We can be chaste. So it was a big deal. And because of passages like that in 1 Corinthians, and then there's another 1 or 2 that are sort of involved with it, it's been suggested that this issue is already a live one in the time of Paul in the 60s CE. I believe Walter Schmidholz would think that, because he thinks a lot of the stuff that is like Marcionism, Gnosticism, Encretism in 1 Corinthians attests the introduction of these notions already that early. Others say, no. These things are better understood as evidence of the lateness of these epistles in which they occur. I tend to go along with that, but again, you can't prove it. And Simon was a famous example of this, because we're told by various ancient sources that he traveled with a concubine, though I'm sure he would have said it was all celibate, on the up and up, a woman named Helen, and that she was, just as he was the incarnation of the great power of God, she was the incarnation of the enoia or epinoia, synonyms for something like the first thought, like the logos, or the first emanation from the divine mind. Sort of like, the Gnostic Sophia, basically. And that she had been somehow tricked into leaving the divine pleroma and falling into the material world. And of course, that's what happened with Sophia, or in another version of the Gnostic myth, the man of light. And her divine substance gave life to the world of the demiurge. But this meant that, and as with all humans who had a piece of that divine light, she had been reincarnated again and again and again through the ages, until Simon took on flesh and entered the time stream and found her as a prostitute in a brothel in Tyre. She had earlier been Helen of Troy, and who knows who else during these ages. And he gave her the gnosis, if you know what I mean. And she was enlightened. And so the two of them traveled around as the awakened couple, I guess, sort of like John and Yogo. And so he would no doubt have claimed this right too. Now, does that mean anybody that defended it was Simon Magus? Of course not. But if you're really beating the bushes to find something that might have come from Simon, that could be.
And when would you date these texts?
What the apocryphal Acts?
What would the material that you believe to be authentic to Paul, Simon Magus?
Um, well, I probably still would say the end of the first century or a little bit into the second, because in my view, they would have been incorporated into a larger text, and that would certainly have been uh, like in 120, 130. So it would have to be a bit earlier than that. But of course, I'm just making half-educated guesses here.
Do you think that the epistles of Paul over time were redacted as new gospels were released to try to put the theology in those texts back into the time of Paul?
Um, you mean it? So they were already in the Gospels from whatever source, and well, it doesn't your question imply that the Pauline epistles are dependent on the Gospels? Because that'd be just the opposite of David Oliver Smith, for instance.
Well, I was just curious to see if you thought that maybe some of the material in the Gospels were used to interpolate Paul.
Yeah, I doubt it, because the resemblance is too glancing. Like if you read in Romans 12, which J.C. O'Neill called a pile of someone's pieces of advice. He thought it wasn't by Paul. And you find some Jesus sounding things in there, like be not overcome with evil, but overcome evil with good. And well, that kind of sounds like, is that in the gospel somewhere? Well, no, it's not. But he does say things like to return good for evil and bless those who curse you and all that. But it isn't really a quote, yet you can also find very similar Buddhist statements that you would guess had come from the Gospels, but there's no real reason to think so. And it's not that rare, some of these things. Like I was watching a commercial for yet another gospel movie called The Chosen. And it's got Jesus standing up there giving the Sermon on the Mount saying, "But I say to you, love your enemies," and so on. And I remember watching, I think, Jeffrey Hunter in the remake of King of Kings. And I thought, here's this vast plain filled with people hanging on every word. And is what he's saying that hypnotic? Is it that striking? I have a hunch that we seem to think so because of being raised with a belief that this is infallible revelation from the upper world, and that Jesus is this shining beacon in a world filled with unremitting darkness. It seems to me it's in a sense that's kind of like positing that something in the gospel sounds too much like something in the epistles. It must have come from it, or vice versa. It's not that close, and there's no attribution. So I could be, somebody could send me an asbestos telegram in Hades someday and say, "Hey, up here in heaven, we just had another session of the Bible seminar, and you were wrong. So-and-so was first." Oh, okay, I always said I could be. But it seems to me a little bit far-fetched. Now, sometimes far-fetched things are true, but again, what's probable? F.C. Bowers said this or that may be probable, may be plausible, but the historian wants to know what is probable, because that's the only thing he can work with. By the way, one thing I wanted to say about the text of the epistles, I just got done reading Jason Badoon's unbelievably erudite book called The First New Testament, where he not only distills what he thinks was in the Marcionite gospel of the Lord, but also what was originally in those letters. And a couple of them, when he's done with them, couldn't possibly be the whole letter. They're just fragments. But most of them just are shorter versions and make sense. But I noticed that in a footnote, he says that my theory about 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 11 being an interpolation is without any basis in the Marcionite text. And then I thought, wait a minute. And I looked back to his reconstruction of it, and the meat of it, verses, I think, 5 through 11, whatever it is, the actual list of resurrection appearances is not there. So instead of refuting my point, he's actually backing it up. Maybe I can ask him about it sometime if I ever see him again. But great book. It is a terrific book.
How shorter do you suspect that the Apostolikon was in comparison to canonical Paul?
Oh, I would guess it's if he's correct, if Jason is correctly delimited it's probably a third shorter, I would estimate. There's quite a bit missing from it, but you certainly know where you are. I mean, it's the rest is certainly recognizable as some form of the familiar text.
Well, we don't got any super chats right now, and yeah, I think we can stop there.
Okay, I'm getting a headache, so that's not a bad idea.
Well, thanks. I thank everybody for their super chat questions today, and Dr. Price, thank you for joining me.
Oh, what a pleasure! Thanks again. I guess I'll be seeing you tomorrow night, probably, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yeah, loads of fun.
Oh, let me try to pull up here what time that's going to be. Okay. The show tomorrow is going to be at 6 p.m. Central Time. And that being said, I'll see everybody later.
Okay.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.